os ciúmes. Já tenho a minha conta de serões serenos. Quero ir dançar. Sei por onde vou, é o melhor caminho. Não deixo nada ao acaso. Por favor, anda a trocar-me o passo. Tenho uma rotina para todos os dias. Há de durar muitos anos. Por favor, anda a estragar-me os planos. Tira os livros da ordem certa. Deixa a janela do quarto aberta. Faz-me esquecer que amanhã vou trabalhar.
Bienvenidos, compañeras y compañeros, al Ágora Política Energética Europea y el caso de la península ibérica.
Policy, we would like to welcome Maria Jesus Montero, Minister of the Treasury, Prime Minister of Portugal, Antonio Costa, and President of Government and Secretary General of the Spanish Socialist Party, Mr. Pedro Sánchez.
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's easy to understand that it is an honor for me to be here today to introduce these two leaders, these two international leaders, two good representatives of the contents, the programs, and the proposals that we have been presenting over these sessions which are proven to be tremendously interesting for those who are participating and, most importantly, for those that are listening in. And it's also very important to talk about a topic and a challenge which is not minor to social democracy for the coming years. All challenges are important. Yesterday we were talking about feminism, and this means that you cannot build a Labour social democrat project without taking into consideration equal opportunity for women. And also, we need to talk about one of the most important challenges that is being faced by all societies, and also chiefly for those that call themselves developed societies, which is to be easy to balance out economic growth and the preservation of the planet, to be able to create an environmental and ecological transition that allows for this transition to happen, and also bears in mind the ultimate consequences, which should allow for a certain redistribution of wealth. All in all, we need to be capable of presenting a project that targets chiefly future generations from that collective feeling, which is socialism, compared to those that are practicing the policy of winner takes all, compared to those failed recipes of the right, the recipes of liberalism, which are failing to find answer for the problems of tomorrow. And here we have two presidents, two leaders of their respective parties in their territories who have been courageous, who have been daring, in not just saying that the environmental agenda must be at the top of the political agenda, but also who have dared to challenge structures that a priori may seem like they had no room for movement. And I'm talking here about the regulation of the energy market, because in every action of the European Commission, we are trying to implement a green perspective, a future-oriented perspective, a forward-looking perspective. This is why it's a pleasure and an honor to be here today with President Sánchez, the newly appointed leader of the Socialist International, and of course, the Prime Minister of Portugal, our comrade, our brother, Antonio Costa, whom it's always an honor to listen to and with whom we want to share our perspective on the future challenges. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to both of them. They are the key players here, and I'm going to propose some topics, and you know them. They will probably elaborate further and steer away from the topic, but this is what this is about. It's about interacting and exchanging and delving deeper into those elements that are very important for this Congress and that must be sent out from here and to the rest of society. This is why, President Sánchez, I'd like to first ask you a question, and then Antonio may elaborate or even dissent from the answer provided by President Sánchez, even though I doubt it. But I think it's, of course, very important to convey that after the pandemic, after COVID, we have shown our vulnerabilities in terms of our health against a microscopic virus that has tried to win the battle, and science, of course, Minister, has allowed us to push it back. But there's with the backdrop of the pandemic and the economic consequences of the pandemic, here at this forum we would like to provide the perspective on the answers that social democracy need to provide for the global challenge that is represented by climate change, and even beyond it, because we need to leave a better planet for future generations. So which are the elements that you consider to be essential so that global politics factors in the different policies to present the great objective, which is at the core of your political agenda right now? Thank you very much, Maria Jesus, Minister of Treasury and Public Function. Please allow me to firstly thank the Prime Minister Costa for being here, the leader of Portuguese socialists. And I'd like to do so in this context, in this Congress of the Socialist International, also to highlight the importance and the contribution of Portuguese socialism, that it's always been there for international socialism and for European socialism. I'd like to focus on two Antonios. Antonio Costa, who's here with us, and Antonio Guterres, the former Secretary General of the UN and also former President of the Socialist International. I'd like to take the baton from what Maria Jesus, the minister, has just said. Particularly in the last years, and particularly after we woke up on the 24th of February with the war that Putin is waging on Ukraine, we've put on the table a key term that was not part of the public conversation as frequently as it is now, which is the term Iberian. And also linked to the word solution, the Iberian solution. What does that mean, directly interpreted? Well, it represents what Portugal and Spain had achieved jointly, both governments, intervening a market that was not functioning, that was actually harming the families, the companies, our industries directly. And it also means protecting the social majority, our co-citizens in Spain and in Portugal. That's what it means directly. But from an indirect perspective, according to me, what this also means is that there is a commitment by governments to put the economy at the service of the people and not the people at the service of the economy. And that Iberian solution is not something that comes by chance. It's due to the fact that there's a social prime minister in Portugal and also a progressive coalition government led by the socialists in Spain. And to cut it short and answer directly what has been mentioned by the Minister of Treasury, and also because she is the Minister of Treasury, I'd like to say that in the speech of the representative of the United Nations at the COP27, talking about climate change, He talked about, for instance, the Iberian community, Antonio, what we've seen there, what we've seen in Africa too, after COVID, and now especially because of the economic consequences of the present war. What we've witnessed is a clear lack of funding for low and middle income countries. The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, talked about creating a tax for big oil at a global level to fund the climate transition that needs to happen in those countries that currently lack the resources that unfortunately some do have and they unfortunately don't. And I think that one of the things that we need to do, Maria Jesus, at the international level, and I think that the Socialist International also needs to lead that discussion, is that of applying tax justice, fiscal tax justice, not just at the country level, but also at the international level. Thank you very much. If you'd allow me to speak freely, I'd like to use a mix between Portuguese and Spanish. I'll try to do it respecting Spanish as much as I possibly can. Maria Jesus, to begin, I would like to greet Pedro for having been appointed to preside the Socialist International. In the last few years, it's been made clear that to face global challenge, we need to have joint action. And this is why an organization such as the Socialist International is very relevant. It's very important to renew it, to give it new blood, new energy, so that the upcoming socialism begins now with Pedro's mandate. And it's more necessary than ever to put on the table the historical values of socialism and social democracy, freedom, democracy, but also solidarity and the fight against inequality. And this is a key aspect if we're going to be talking about climate change. If we need to undergo an energy transition, if we need to undergo an ecological transition, that must be done fairly. It must be fair at the global level. As Pedro mentioned, it's very important that all countries play a role in decreasing greenhouse emissions because their contributions are not equal and the consequences that they suffer are not equal either. And frankly, those who make the least emissions are the ones that are paying the highest price for climate change. And this is why it's essential to have global justice. But there also needs to be justice in terms of the transition at our country level, because let us be clear, what the transition means is that we need to stop producing in a certain way and we need to start producing in a different way. For instance, in Portugal, we have moved forward from 2023 to 2021, the closing of the 2 power production plants that were based on coal. And that meant the shutting down of 2 production plants, and that also entailed thousands of jobs. So in order for that transition to be fair, we need to have a plan, like we did, and we currently do, a social plan for regional development, because the impact of the closing of these 2 plants cannot also impact employment and lead to underdevelopment in those regions that used to have those production plants. So if we don't have a fair transition, we will lose the support from the public to this transition. And therefore, without the people, we won't achieve the results that we're aiming at. So this is a societal change. We need to engage everyone, the elderly, the youngest, those who work, those that don't, those that work at wind farms, at hydraulic plants, at solar plants, but also those that used to work at coal plants or other plants that worked with non-renewable sources. This is why it's very important that we feed from that we draw from the values of social democracy, because only through social justice will we achieve what we have set out to.
Transición.
Fair transition, just transition. We always use that adjective in every program, in every policy that are being approved in Portugal as well as in Spain. But there is a global call that comes with this to all societies so that they make a contribution as much as they possibly can. And this means that we need to advocate for consumption policies, industrial production policies. We also need to be capable of putting the finger on the future market niches that are opening up hand in hand with all this, because a great enemy to this transition is precisely what you just mentioned, that some are actually trying to put out there that this comes at a cost, as if this was something innovative, that progressive governments are trying to do something that cannot be assumed in terms of the cost by society. And this is something that is trying to put forward solutions that we always hear presidents talk about the fact that this is a great opportunity, especially for countries that are trying to foster the training of human capital so that we can all get prepared for that future. So how do you think that countries should prepare for this, so that this really brings about wealth in the future, so that this brings about well-being and also creates a better planet? Okay, investing in renewable is indeed about creating new safety and independence conditions. This is something that we've seen in the past with the example of Russia, but we can extrapolate this too. The more dependent we are on fossil fuels, the more dependent we will be on the providers of those fossil fuels. We don't have fossil fuels, but we have the capacity to produce solar power, wind power, hydraulic power. And this guarantees energy security, power security, and lessens the external dependency for countries. Secondly, this poses a great economic opportunity because we are going to have the opportunity to create new economic activities, new jobs, in new power production centers that we didn't have before. We didn't have people employed working on gas production, working on oil production, but we have people producing hydraulic power, solar power, wind power. And this is a second and very important advantage. Third advantage, science. Technique is helping us create new opportunities. We have accessible renewable power now, and that opens up an opportunity so that we can really answer to a core topic, which is that of storage. The storage of the renewable power produced. Green hydrogen or other renewable gases are great opportunities, and for those of us that have the optimal natural conditions to produce wind power, solar power, and hydraulic power, we need to make the best of that opportunity. And finally, Portugal and Spain have the greatest European reserves of lithium. We don't know whether lithium will be a key mineral for transition batteries or whether lithium is here to stay. But the truth is that that opportunity is right there. For instance, the government of Spain has a plan on battery, and actually they have a contract with Volkswagen. And this is very important possibly for Spain, but it'll also be important for the Iberian Peninsula as a whole. We are trying to make our modest contribution with a more reduced budget, but we're also trying to do our best so that we can harness the lithium reserves that we have. But in addition, this is also a great opportunity for international cooperation because the most important lithium reserves in other areas are also located in South America, for instance. And I think that Portugal and Spain have the responsibility of bringing Europe closer to South America, because South America is indeed the region of the world where European values are most present. We speak the same languages there, and those resources offer a great opportunity for development, a just global and international development for those countries that can become providers of lithium, especially Chile and Argentina. Yes, and I do remember. Well, actually, I'd like to share a story. When we were negotiating the Iberian solution, Antonio and myself were negotiating with the Commission, but most importantly with those countries that always say no, for starters. They always say no initially, not because they disagree, but rather because it's their policy to say no first. It's like a habit that we're trying to break from. But they didn't really understand what this thing, the Iberian solution, was about. So you're funding gas with public resources. It's quite the opposite to what we want, isn't it? Which is mitigating the effects of climate change and becoming decoupled from this type of energy, from this type of power. And we said, no, this is not a public subsidy. It's quite the opposite. What we're doing is, thanks to the energy mix that we have in Portugal and in Spain, which is overriding, it has a very important role for renewable energies, and they're cheaper. So we can use the differential without public resources in the Iberian solution. And it took them a while to understand it. But when they saw the effect, when they perceived how crazy it is that prices are so high, prices of power are so high in international markets. There's been a new increase in the TTF market in Europe in the last few days. Well, at this point, they have come to realize that this market intervention doesn't just follow the political will of two socialist governments. It also is a bet that Portugal and Spain are doing on renewable energies. And I think it's very important to point this out. At the end of the day, the effort that consumers made in Portugal early in the decade of 2010, Antonio, you've raised this oftentimes, and the effort that Spanish consumers have made also to be at the forefront of the use and production of electricity from renewable sources also bears its fruits, as Antonio mentioned before, in terms of security and energy sovereignty. And I'd like to point out that Portugal and Spain, both of them, have a great opportunity with European funds. And we need to also create utopias. And the Iberian utopias are always positive for Europe as a whole. And the utopia of making the Iberian Peninsula in Europe become the largest provider of green hydrogen, which will be the energy of the future, is, I think, a reality and a winning bet for Europe, for Portugal and Spain. And of course, I must say that there's things in politics that make you act and take a step forward. But I must say that for me, the fact that the Iberian Peninsula can become an export power for the first time in our history, an exporter of clean, sovereign energy that also abides by our environmental commitments, that is something that is really worth working for. Undoubtedly, President, one of the great contributions that the update of social democracy is doing, that constantly requires an effort of being ahead of challenges and adapting to all those threats. But it's something that we've heard you mention oftentimes. We need a new way to understand relationships now and in the near future. We need to engage with different generations, and we need to know that our conditions mark our tomorrow. Today's actions mark our tomorrow, and it's very important to put the youth at the center of our agendas, and we all need to show solidarity and the limit growth, the growth that we had in the past that had an unequal distribution of wealth, and we need to create a new order based on the new definitions, and having the new transformations of the productive model. We mentioned before that household economies also need to adapt. All in all, environmentalism is going to be another element to those values of democracy and justice for the future. So, in what sense do you think that the Iberian solution, which focuses on power, but it also intends to become a development model for the future, so to what extent will we have to engage with the youth, with the elderly, so that they can actively participate in this process, so that this can actually become a new opportunity, an opportunity of new values that will be part of our political agenda as something essential? So, Maria Jesus, as I mentioned in the beginning, the Iberian solution is an intervention, but it represents much more than that. It's about placing the economy at the service of the people and not the other way around, as happened, unfortunately, during the financial crisis. And against this backdrop, I think there's been very many contributions made by the two governments, and I'd like to stand for what happened in 2021 under the presidency of Portugal of the European Union. There was a very important summit, which was the Porto Summit, and Antonio there took the baton from Stefan Löfven, another socialist prime minister, now president of European Socialist, and they organized the Porto Social Summit, and they developed the social pillar, which is closely linked to what you mentioned about the youth, Maria Jesus, because, for instance, we took on board the commitment to increase the employment rate until 2030 to guarantee that more than 60% of active workers are reskilled or skilled as part of this new economy that is arising, and highlighting especially the role of the youth. So I think that, as Antonio mentioned, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that transition is happening. The ecological transition is happening, but the key is to give a social anchor to digital transformation and ecological transition. I think that the contribution that Antonio made at the Porto Summit, talking about the social pillar, is already bearing fruit, and I see some European MPs. We're talking about the minimum salary there at the European level. There is a discussion about the labor rights that also need to be granted to workers that work on digital platforms. Well, all in all, Antonio mentioned before that in this world of transformation, we need to provide new answers to new challenges that our societies are facing up to. And based on those challenges and those answers, we must create utopias, causes that should mobilize many people. First, they should mobilize those that feel like they are socialist or laborist or social democrats, and also those people that consider that social justice is something that can help them move forward and do political activism. And that's something represented by progressive forces the world over. Now, going back to what Antonio said, and I'll finish with this, I think it's essential to not lose track of our values, to keep them at the center, to keep them as something core to us. They have always defined us, and I've always claimed that equality should be the main cause that moves us. So I do think that, yes, the environmental transition, the ecological transition will happen. It's already happening, but we, compared to other political projects, what we do is to introduce inclusion, social and territorial integration, also from the standpoint of digital transformation. Sometimes I joke about the right that we have in our country, in Spain, because really in Spain we have a far right that does not believe in climate change, and a right that says that climate change exists, but they act as if there weren't any climate change. So we are two political forces that are long-standing, that have a long tradition in Portugal and in Spain, and indeed we draw from those values, but most importantly, we are capable of providing new answers to the new challenges faced by our societies. And that's the great difference and the great value that Iberian solution has. We are agile enough to adapt ourselves and to update our ideas to be electorally competitive and continue to be an ideological reference that even go beyond the borders of the Iberian Peninsula. Yes, Pedro, I think we socialists and social democrats can strike the right balance between the competitiveness of the economy, the energy and energetic change that needs to happen, and the social justice that needs to be in place. This is why in our presidency, we have set as a priority to approve the action plan on the social pillar of the European Union. And there's very specific commitments about this. For instance, throughout this decade, 60% of workers must have at least one training action per year, because this is something that will be decisive to keep them qualified to face climate change or digital transformation, because here we are facing a double transformation, which is very important. And it's true, the right has a hard time grasping what it's necessary to do in order for change to be possible. When 15 years ago we started investing in renewables, the right was against that. When 5 years ago we started approving a strategy for hydrogen, they said that hydrogen had no future. And even now, when we've managed to strike an agreement with France to unblock the pipelines, and they said that this was not good for Portugal. That it might be good for Spain, but not for Portugal. And I wonder, how were we going to interconnect with France without going through Spain? I really wonder. I don't know any other physical way to get there. But apparently the right doesn't know its geography. But we need to continue. We need to go ahead, because we can indeed have the Iberian solution. First, because we are separated from the European market. We only have a 3% interconnection with the rest of Europe. But there's another very important reason, which is that this solution works for countries that already have a high level of renewably sourced energy. With the drought that we are experiencing, and I hope this is currently changing, but we have had very little hydraulic power produced this year. But still then, our energy prices are more competitive than those of the French, the Italians, and we have managed to effectively reduce the prices in comparison to the prices that we would be paying without the Iberian solution. But I think this is an open secret. When the Commission proposed as a potential solution extending the Iberian solution to the rest of countries, many have answered that this wouldn't work for them. And it doesn't work for them because they have so little renewably sourced power that the price of these marginal powers wouldn't offset the reduction of the end price of electricity. So this means that for us, this is something essential, because we are increasing the competitiveness of our companies. Our companies that already have the problem of being far away from the center of the European market, which have to bear structural costs that are higher than for those companies that are in the center of Europe. But now we have a very important competitive advantage, which is the cost of energy compared to others. And that is a very big economic advantage that we need to work for too.
Pues Antonio, en este último...
Antonio, on that last point that you mentioned, and this will be my last question because of time constraints, I'd like to say that indeed you are two leaders that have international influence, undoubtedly. And I know that places a great responsibility on your shoulders, but you also have the challenges of proposing guidelines that are not always adequately interpreted, and you always face resistance. And we need to do pedagogy, and we need to constantly keep track of this, because at the European level, we're constantly redefining tax rules, fiscal rules. We need to take into account the investment needs that need to happen in this context, and this shouldn't compete with other needs of citizens, for instance, with regards to public services. There are very important discussions on taxes, for instance, at the OECD and at other international bodies, that we're trying to make sure that there are no burdens, no negative comparisons with regards to the citizens that also need to make their contributions as taxpayers. Also, we need to buffer aggressive attitudes towards the environment that could also stem from fiscal aspects. So, moving forward, how do you think that we should be present in all the bodies where socialists are present? How do you think we should raise the fact that climate change, the fight against climate change is something that we need to bear in mind? We're coming up with all the different parameters necessary for the future. For instance, the fiscal rules that are necessary for the next decade. So how do you think we should make progress in that direction? What is the message that we can send to worldwide institutions from this Forum of Social Democracy, so that they know what the roadmap will be, the roadmap that will be followed in all the different fora where socialists are present? Thank you, Maria Jesus. I frequently make a comparison between how Europe has reacted to the crisis in 2011 and how it has reacted to the COVID crisis in 2020. In 2011, the reaction was austerity, and this was a tragedy. And in 2020, when there was COVID, the reaction was that of solidarity. And this was a great success, not just from the healthcare standpoint, but also from the social standpoint, from the economic standpoint. No one has been left behind, but together we have done this. We made it using masks to protect one another. We made it drawing from a feeling of community, being locked up in our own homes. And in Europe, we also did it using the PSOE, which has allowed us to keep employment and companies when they were shut down. It has created next generation funds in order to allow countries to recover from the economic crisis and the budgetary pressure that they were under after the pandemic. And the truth is that this has been a success. All European countries are growing. All European countries are recovering in their employment levels. All European countries are managing to protect the household incomes and uphold their companies. And of course, we're facing the challenge of the Russian war on Ukraine, and this is not helping. But imagine what situation we would be in if we had responded in 2020 the way we responded in 2011. So we must, of course, draw from the lessons learned. And all the colleagues that start by saying no always, they need to learn too, you know? And the truth is that if we had good results during COVID, something that we need to now implement is to have permanent instruments, because we know that crises are a recurrent phenomenon. Sometimes it's an economic crisis, sometimes it's COVID, tomorrow it's the war, and it's something that we cannot prevent. There will be another crisis tomorrow. Crises are part of history, but we need to have a permanent tool instead of thinking of a new tool every time a crisis comes. We start with a new discussions again. We shouldn't do it that way. We need to have a permanent tool to protect employment and protect companies across all the different crises that may arise in the future. And of course, we need to have fiscal rules that guarantee the stability, the macroeconomic stability. In terms of debt, in terms of deficit, but we also need to create the necessary conditions so that the reduction of debt can be compatible with the capacity and the efforts that countries can make. We cannot all wear the same size of jacket. It would be ridiculous to have me wear Pedro's jacket. He is 2 meters high. That doesn't work. So we need to have debt reduction plans made to the measure of the different countries and their needs, because the protection of us all, the protection of most developed countries also revolves around guarantee, and that those that have imbalances and inequalities can overcome their own imbalances to not create a collective risks, which will be paid at a higher price by those that have the lower resources. At the end of the day, we need to have fiscal rules that are investment friendly, because there will be no digital transition, no environmental transition without investment. So we need to have the capacity in place. Personally, and maybe here we disagree, I don't know, but what will guarantee a leveled playing field amongst us is to have a European fund, because budgetary exceptions are good for those that have room for maneuver, those that can actually absorb those exceptions. But for those countries that have a very high debt, that is a fake generosity, because at the end of the day, we don't have the capacity to make use of those budgetary exceptions. So what we need is next generation digital EU, so that we can make the investments that are necessary to make and create the macroeconomic conditions for the private industry, from the private sector, to also do their share, make the investments that they need to make and that they're making to improve the competitiveness of their companies. Thank you. Antonio, I think you also deserve a round of applause, because his Spanish Portuguese is practically more Spanish than Portuguese. I wished I could speak the Portuguese that you speak in Spanish. I mean, I wish. I don't disagree, not at all, quite the contrary. I think this whole situation reminds me of the discussions that we had early in the pandemic, when we started talking about the fact that a European fund was necessary. Some countries said that it wasn't, but in the end of the day, what we did was to stand for the single market, which is one of the main European conquests and achievements. And practically the same is happening now. If we want the energy and economic crisis, if we want to come out of this economic and energy crisis to come out stronger, we need the mechanisms to face this crisis and others to come. And this is why Spain does share the same objectives as Portugal. In the last 2 weeks, Maria Jesus, I've been sharing an anecdote that took place in the General Assembly of the UN. If you heard it before, I apologize, but it's something that is quite striking. I was at an interview and they asked me, and they said, as the leader of a country in the global north, what do you think about the demands of the global south? And that felt strange, because saying to someone from Cadiz that he is in the global north feels a bit awkward. It's a bit strange. there's very artificial propositions that are gaining ground, and obviously there's many people and many comrades here in the Socialist International, that share that narrative, that of the global North and the global South. And we need to blur those division lines. We need to come up with the shared solutions to those shared challenges that we bear with different intensities, as you mentioned before. And this should be done through coordinated, progressive forces and progressive governments beyond Europe, and of course establishing bonds with the Iberian, Latin American and South American communities and other areas of the world. And in the Iberian Peninsula, I can attest to this because I've been present at many discussions in the European Council, both Portugal as much as Spain, possibly because here we are celebrating our past achievements or what happened thanks to Magallanes and El Llano. Maybe because of that past, we have a more comprehensive perspective than some other comrades. And I think that a collaboration of progressive governments the world over is very important. And this is something that the Socialist International can work for that coordination, firstly. Secondly, also to make proposals where we are in government and where we are not in government too, so that we can lead those proposals from the opposition too. And thirdly, also so that we can extend our hands to those parties in countries that are undergoing democratic consolidation processes. And Portugal and Spain went through that process not that long ago, actually yesterday, precisely. I was recalling that in Spain we held a meeting of the Socialist International in 1980, and we were just beginning to go down the pathway of democracy. And Felipe González also could harness the fact that we had the visit of important international socialists, such as, for instance, Billy Brandt, that helped endorse the socialist project that was starting to be created. And I don't think that this was the key to the success of in the elections in 1982, but it probably had something to do with it. So I think that here, from our Socialist International, we can extend our hand to other parties that are in the process of democratic consolidation or fighting for democracy in other countries. Why do I say this? Because I think that indeed, when we talk about how we can respond to the food crisis, the energy crisis, the economic crisis that is being provoked by Putin's war on Ukraine, it's very important to reinforce multilateralism. It's very important to know that there is a discussion in Europe around the resources and how to allocate them, public investment, fiscal rules, as you both mentioned. But in some other countries, this is a utopia because they don't have the resources. And now the harsher monetary policies are causing liquidity to go to United States, to more developed countries, and this is smothering them, and this is suffocating them. And it's not that they can no longer think about ecological transition. They cannot even respond to the food crisis that they're already enduring. And I think that here the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has put forward very interesting discussions, and both Portugal as much as Spain have made their contributions as far as we can, being middle-sized economies at the global scale. We have contributed to those solutions with 20% of those special rights to fund that fund of the IMF, the resilience fund for the fund for resilience and ecological transition for those countries that have fewer resources. So we need to break from that narrative, the difference between global South and global North, and the power that progressive forces have in order to push this forward lies in our coordination. And I think that that's the purpose that the Socialist International can serve, and that will be my commitment as president of the Socialist International. I mean, needless to say, on behalf of everyone here and those who are listening in, we must say that we are very proud of you, of the work that you do, how you constantly turn challenges into opportunity, how you constantly deliver a message that safeguards those values that we drew from in our creation and that have prevailed throughout the process of social democracy and that are, of course, future-oriented, future-looking, and we get very excited when we see you trying to influence the global policies that will mark the future of our planet. You have our support, and hopefully in the new meeting of the Socialist International we will see more countries of the world represented that have indeed put at the top of their agenda climate change, supporting the youth, the future generations, and so that socialism can be feminist and green. Green and red are a very good combination, and that is the flagship that will mark future conquests for us. Thank you very much, everybody, for having joined us this afternoon.
Serões serenos, quero ir dançar. Sei por onde vou, é o melhor caminho. Não deixo nada ao